So I grew up in a place where people worked really hard, but didn't necessarily have a leg up, right? And so you had this understanding of the fact that people's life circumstances are not necessarily a result of any deficit on their part, but that they are products of the structures within when they operate.
I am Madiane Andrade, and from the University of Toronto, this is the new normal.
Inclusion has always been part of the environment in which I've grown up.
This is Wisdom Tete, Vice President of the University of Toronto, Principal of the University of Toronto Scarborough, and also a Professor of Political Science and Critical Development Studies. Wisdom's life began in Ghana. His international experiences have shaped his views on citizenship. Okay, I'm going to push you a little on the idea of inclusion, because today is this historic day. We're sitting here discussing this on Inauguration Day. And although a lot of us are looking south with just horror, and for some of us, we're looking south with rage, to what extent can we think about what's happening being not just the result of white supremacy, but also arising from fear of some parts of that society, of white people who've not been able to see themselves move forward in the way they want to because of the way things are structured there.
Inclusion comes from having to start with an acknowledgement of inequity, right? Because that is what challenges you to look at whether or not what we profess to be as societies. Because if you look at our written documents, they look like perfect
yes, they do.
expressions of what we want to be. And that is when this, you guys keep talking about, working towards a more perfect union. People focus on the perfect, but I think it talks about the inadequacy of what we have now and the need for us to then think about how do we try to continue to, approximate that perfection. And that requires that those founding documents that we appeal to without being critical about them, because those founding documents in the states itself have embedded in them inequities. And so the acknowledgement of imperfection and the responsibility we have as citizens to continue to make things better becomes part of our mandate and our responsibility, right, as citizens. And it seems to me that that process of growth from acknowledging that there are ills in our society, we're not perfect, and moving us to an understanding of how those ills have created inequities and divisions, and then using that as a basis then to say, how do we heal by making one another better, right? And those are conversations that are sometimes uncomfortable, but are necessary.
Seeking to understand those with whom you disagree is not apologizing, but it is essential if we are to move forward. The temptation to vilify, the temptation to ignore context is strong. Understanding is not apologizing.
And so going back to your point about the divisions in the United States, for example, I would argue that racism is not just a white and black thing. And there's an important reason why we talk about anti-black racism, because Blacks also face racism from racialized communities, right? And so even within the group of people who are on the margins, there are differences there, and there are, different kinds of discrimination. And I think this is where the point you raised comes in, that in the US, there are a lot of people, say in Appalachia, who have a lot more in common with their compatriots who are in the inner cities and suffering because they're all socioeconomically marginalized. But their, kind of phenotypical characteristics have been elevated to a point of pride and ascendancy, and then the very things that should in fact bind them with their other compatriots to fight for what inures to the common benefit gets lost, right? And so they operate in this world where the victim narrative is very narrow, is in terms of your race and these people are taking something from you, and people always look at the idea of giving to others or restoring fairness and equity has taken away. And so if you listen to some of the folks, who were part of the insurrection, there's a sense of loss. And that loss, is attributed to the fact that other people are in fact being brought up to what should in fact be the base of that
expectation for everyone,
right? So I think, we lose the opportunity to build a bigger tent where our shared needs and our shared responsibilities come together to make us better. And we operate in this narrow confines. So until we transcend that, these divisions will continue to be there.
So, and that I agree, that's back to that concept of citizenship, but also understanding your different levels of responsibility. So clearly, as citizens of Canada, some of that discernment has to be employed when we vote. Some of that discernment has to be employed when we think at the local level, what am I doing with respect to the health orders and where are our numbers? So how do we deal with that? The constant need to be monitoring self-interest versus public good. I feel like the pandemic has taught us something.
Right.
And do you think that we will be able to carry it through into our everyday life afterwards?
Right. Certainly that is my hope, that we learn, but there are days when you are reminded that we haven't learned, right? So if you take some of the simple things like wearing masks, right? And people look at it in terms of their own vulnerability, and if I don't feel vulnerable, then it doesn't matter what happens to other people, right? And citizenship has to have an other-facing dimension to it. It just doesn't have to be me, right? As we latch onto rugged individualism, which is a hallmark of
North American life and capitalist society,
we should understand that our very survival is dependent on others. And recognizing then that when we help one another out, we help ourselves as individuals. We can all get out of this sooner if we all work together. Either it's by wearing our masks, or it's by helping other parts of society get the vaccines in the order that makes the most sense, right? So that I'm not jumping the line.
Right.
If we do that, we'll be able to get out. We'll be able to help address some of these things better than we currently do. So I think if we begin to look at these things in terms of the good of the collective, then we'll do our part to be able to get there, right? But not everybody has the luxury of that. And so I think being very careful that we're not overly judgmental on people who may not be able to get out of do the things that we may be able to do, right? And that's how we've always worked as a society. Some help others help some, depending on where we are positioned. And we're all differently positioned.
The pandemic has shown us how interconnected we are. Recognizing that we have not reached those aspirations yet is the first step. When a citizen looks at their reflection, they realize they need to see the others who help them reach the mirror.
Walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down to the Capitol.
What do you think are the lasting effects of Trumpism, the laying bare of selfishness at a national level in a way that we have not seen before, I think, in North America? And do you think that the effects that you've talked about, the positive things that have come through the pandemic, can help us offset those? Just
looking at the Capitol today, for a lot of people who have always pointed to the United States as this kind of model of, modern democracy. It looks to me like what I've seen during coup d'etat, right, where you have troops, on the streets, and you feel like you are in this, war zone, right?
Both sides are armed.
Exactly. It is exactly right. And so this is such, a profound moment. Not in terms of something that elevates, but something that I think is sobering, right? About how a democracy can degenerate. Because I think it's going to take a lot to rebuild the trust in institutions. It's going to take a lot to build trust in one another. Americans are walking around very nervous and suspicious of one another. And I think that is going to take a while to get over. And the new presidency is not necessarily going to transform that, because these things have deep-rooted, seeds in people's, historical evolution from certain fundamental beliefs that, Americans tend to think they've transcended, and it's interesting when even here in Canada, we talk about that's not who we are, right? In the States, that's not who we are. Well, that's who we are, right?
Those are elements who we are, and that's what we're seeing, and that's why it's so disturbing.
Right? So it's sometimes very deceptively comforting to talk about this is not who we are, just so that we can focus on the other things. But this is fundamental to who we are. It goes to my point about recognition as a fundamental prerequisite for making the changes that are necessary. Because if we gloss over this and say, oh, this is not who we are, this has been growing for a while, right? It's not surprising to a lot of observers of the United States that they are where they are, right? And I think in Canada, we also kind of, lull into this comfort about is the United States, and, we're not like them. But, these things sometimes are subterranean. They're happening beneath the surface, and the gloss is just this much deep, right? And
attitudes don't stop at the border, right?
Well, exactly, right? and this is where the media comes in, because a lot of things we saw an emergence of this in Europe, right, with a lot of right-wing groups beginning to get some ascendancy, and it looked like this was Europe. It was happening way on the other side of the world. Well, now with media and so on, people have their beliefs reinforced by others. It is positioning them really well. They have access to material that, again, reinforces their own beliefs and so on. So it's going to be, this is where, for me, critical media literacy is important, particularly in a world where information is flowing all the time. And the notion of fake news, because if it's not my kind of news, then it's fake, instead of interrogating critically and learning from it. And so we have to continue this process of learning that enables us to unlearn certain things that we've come to imbibe or accept as truth, and have the humility to challenge ourselves and to be willing to let go things that have no basis, right? And that is one of the hardest things for people, is the ability to grow. And part of that growth is for you to accept, your mistakes, learn, and be able to be a better version of yourself. It takes all of us doing our part and continuing to challenge ourselves to learn, to reach out, to get into spaces that we're not comfortable with. As an academic institution, we talk about the importance of our students being global citizens, right? Because it allows them to be challenged, it allows them to learn, it allows them to get outside of what they're comfortable with. And through those interactions, we then learn, we grow, and hopefully become better versions of ourselves for the benefit of the collective as opposed to the self.
I am Madiane Andrade. This is the new normal.